Imagine standing on a football field where the roar of the crowd isn't heard, only felt. The thud of cleats on turf, the vibration of helmets colliding, the heavy breathing of teammates before the snap, all of it exists in a world where silence rules. This was Riverside, a small American town with a high school football team that carried not only helmets and pads but also the weight of silence. These were not ordinary players. They were deaf. And yet, within that silence was a sound louder than any cheer, the sound of defiance. From the very beginning, their story was never about pity, but about power. It was about young men who refused to let a label define the boundaries of their destiny. In America, football is more than a sport. It is a culture, a heartbeat of Friday nights, a sacred ritual of sweat and pride. But for the Riverside boys, the rules of the game were written against them. They could not hear the quarterback's cadence. They could not listen to the coach's booming pep talks. They could not even hear the whistle that started the play. Every single snap required innovation, discipline, and a new language of football, one built on trust, vision, and instinct. The problem wasn't just the opponents across the line of scrimmage. The problem was a world that said, "You can't." And that word, "can't," became the fuel that turned boys into warriors. Every revolution starts with a leader who sees what others cannot. For the Boys of Riverside, it was Coach Simmons, a man who carried both grit and vision, like a modern-day Steve Jobs of the gridiron. Where others saw limitation, he saw possibility. Where others saw weakness, he saw strength. He stood before his players one day and said, "We will not play to prove we belong. We will play to prove we can win." That single shift, from survival to triumph, was their iPhone moment, the spark of innovation that would disrupt the narrative of what it meant to be deaf and an athlete. The team wasn't just preparing for games, they were preparing to change history, but vision alone doesn't win championships. The Riverside boys faced brutal practices under the scorching sun, aching muscles that screamed louder than any voice, and moments where frustration threatened to break them. Some nights, players went home wondering if it was even worth it, if society had been right all along. They were bruised, tired, and overshadowed by schools with louder reputations and bigger budgets. And yet, within every setback lay a hidden seed of resilience. Each drop of sweat carried a silent promise: we will rise. This wasn't just football anymore. It was survival, it was identity, it was their declaration to the world that silence was not weakness, but a new form of strength. And so the question began to echo, not in sound, but in thought, in spirit: what if they could actually win? What if a team of boys who could not hear could outthink, outfight, and outplay teams who had every advantage? What if Riverside became more than just a school? What if it became a symbol for anyone who had ever been told no? That possibility electrified the locker room, like an idea in the early days of a garage startup, fragile yet powerful enough to shake the world. The boys didn't just want to play football. They wanted to create a revolution. And revolutions don't whisper. They roar. To win, Riverside had to reinvent football itself. In a sport that thrives on noise, they created a language of silence. No shouted audibles, no last-minute calls, no frantic sidelines yelling over the crowd. Instead, eyes, hands, movements. A quarterback's glance became a command. A nod meant attack. A clap, a motion, a sharp signal cut through the chaos like lightning. They developed a rhythm so precise it felt like art, a symphony without sound. Where opponents relied on noise, Riverside relied on connection, pure, unshakable trust. And for the first time, the silence wasn't a burden. It was their secret weapon. But no story of innovation comes without resistance. From the bleachers, rival fans sneered. "They don't belong here," some muttered. Opposing coaches complained, claiming Riverside's system was unfair, like trickery instead of strategy. Even local newspapers, hesitant to cover their victories, framed them as inspirational underdogs rather than legitimate contenders. The boys weren't just fighting opponents on the field. They were battling the invisible chains of perception. Every headline, every whisper, every dismissive glance was another brick in the wall they had to smash through. And the more people doubted, the stronger their resolve became. Then came a night that would change everything. Riverside faced Jefferson High, a powerhouse with a history of crushing opponents. The bleachers were packed, the air buzzing with Friday night energy. And yet, when the game began, the field fell into a strange rhythm. Riverside's players moved like shadows, flowing as one. Silent signals, flawless execution, a defense that hit with thunder. By halftime, Jefferson was stunned. By the fourth quarter, the unthinkable had happened. Riverside won. Not by luck, not by pity, but by strategy, grit, and fire. The crowd didn't just cheer, they stood in awe. For the first time, the question wasn't whether Riverside could play football. The question was, how far could they go? That victory did more than add a number to the win column. It rewired their identity. Players who once slouched under the weight of doubt now stood taller, eyes blazing with belief. Parents who once feared for their children's dreams now cheered with unshakable pride. Even the community, once hesitant, once unsure, began to rally. Riverside was no longer the team nobody believed in. They were a storm-gathering force, and every player knew it. With each practice, each drill, each drop of sweat, they weren't just chasing a ball. They were chasing a future where nothing was impossible, but winning one game was only the beginning. Championships don't come from a single night. They come from persistence, from relentless pursuit, from daring to dream bigger than anyone thought possible. Coach Simmons gathered the team in the locker room and laid it out plain: we are not done. We will not be remembered for one win. We will be remembered as the team that showed the world what silence can achieve. His words hit harder than any tackle. This was no longer about football. It was about legacy. The Riverside boys were on a quest, not just for a trophy, but for glory, the kind of glory that rewrites what people believe is possible. With every win, Riverside's silence grew louder. Suddenly, the spotlight was on them. Local newspapers now called them the Miracle Team, and scouts began showing up on the sidelines. But with recognition came pressure, suffocating, relentless pressure. Every opponent wanted to be the one to break them, to prove that Riverside's rise was nothing more than luck. Practices turned brutal. Injuries piled up. Nights grew longer. For the first time, cracks began to show. The players who once thrived on unity now snapped at each other, frustration boiling under the weight of expectation. It was no longer just football, it was survival against the crushing burden of greatness. And then came Oak Ridge High, the kind of rival that every great story demands. Oak Ridge wasn't just talented, they were ruthless. Bigger players, faster runners, louder crowds. Their coach openly mocked Riverside: they don't belong in this league. It was more than disrespect. It was war. When Riverside faced Oak Ridge mid-season, the silent strategy faltered. Oak Ridge anticipated signals, broke through the line, and crushed Riverside in a brutal game that left players sprawled across the field in exhaustion and heartbreak. The scoreboard told the story in harsh numbers: Riverside had been beaten. The dream, it seemed, was shattering, that loss cut deeper than any bruise. In the locker room afterward, helmets lay abandoned on the floor. Some players wept. Others sat in silence, staring at the concrete walls, their faces etched with defeat. For the first time, belief seemed fragile. One player muttered in sign language, "Maybe they're right. Maybe we can't." The words hung in the air like poison. Even Coach Simmons felt the weight pressing on his chest. This was the crossroad. Every great journey has one, the moment when giving up feels easier than pushing forward. And for Riverside, that night threatened to swallow everything they had fought for. But champions are not made in victory. They are forged in defeat. Coach Simmons knew it. He gathered the boys the next day, not in the locker room, but on the field under the blazing sun. He pointed to the grass and signed, "This is where we rise. This is where we decide who we are." He reminded them that Riverside wasn't built on privilege or talent handed to them. It was built on grit, on silence turned into strength. Slowly, belief flickered back. Players began signing to each other, not words of despair, but words of fire: "We're not done." That day, something powerful shifted. The dream wasn't dead. It was being reborn. The weeks that followed became legend. Riverside trained like men possessed. Every practice was sharper, faster, harder. They rewired their signals, disguising plays so Oak Ridge or any other rival could never predict them again. Injured players fought through rehab with a warrior's determination. And the bond between them, once frayed, grew stronger than ever. They weren't just teammates anymore, they were brothers, united by a cause bigger than football. Every sprint, every tackle, every moment of exhaustion was fueled by one thought: redemption. The championship was no longer just a dream. It was a calling. The air turned crisp as fall deepened, and with it came the playoffs. For most teams, it was about strategy. For Riverside, it was about destiny. They entered the first round with the weight of silence pressing on them, but this time, silence wasn't heavy, it was sharp, like a blade. Their signals flowed like electricity, their defense hit harder than ever, and their offense carved through the field with surgical precision. Each game was a statement: we belong here. Opponents walked onto the field confident and left stunned, shaking their heads at how a team without sound could move with such perfection. Riverside wasn't just winning games. They were rewriting the rulebook. By the second round, Riverside was no longer just a local story. National reporters arrived with cameras, eager to capture the miracle. Headlines read, "The Silent Warriors and Riverside's Deafening Rise." The boys found themselves on magazine covers, their faces splashed across television screens. Interviews poured in, though often awkward, as reporters fumbled to understand their language. Yet with fame came distraction. Autograph requests, news crews at practice, constant questions about how it feels to be inspirational. For the players, it was flattering, but also dangerous. Coach Simmons reminded them with a steely glare, glory doesn't come from headlines. It comes from winning. The team had to learn balance, humility in the spotlight, hunger on the field. The semi-final was a war zone. Riverside faced Clearwater High, a team built like giants, with a defense that had bullied opponents all season. The game became a brutal back and forth, every yard earned in blood and sweat. Riverside signals were tested like never before. A single misread glance could mean disaster. But where Clearwater relied on brute force, Riverside relied on precision. Play after play, they chipped away, wearing down the Giants. By the fourth quarter, with the score tied, Riverside's quarterback sent one sharp signal. The ball flew, the receiver cut like lightning, and the end zone lit up. Touchdown! Victory! The silent stadium erupted, not in sound, but in vibration, in stomping feet and waving arms. Riverside was heading to the championship. The week before the championship was surreal. Practices were sharp, but quieter than usual. Players carried the weight of what was coming. They knew this wasn't just another game. It was the game. The chance to etch their names in history. At night, players lay awake in their beds, staring at the ceiling, replaying plays in their heads, imagining the roar of a crowd they would never hear but would always feel. Some wrote notes to themselves: don't quit. Don't break. This is our time. For Coach Simmons, it was the hardest week of his life. He knew the game would test every ounce of their strength, not just their bodies, but their souls. Finally, the night arrived. The stadium lights blazed against the dark sky, illuminating a field that felt more like a battlefield than a football ground. Thousands of fans packed the stands, the noise rumbling like a storm the boys couldn't hear but could feel shaking through their bones. Across the field stood Oak Ridge, the rival who had humiliated them months before. Bigger, louder, meaner. The memory of that loss still burned in Riverside's hearts. This was redemption. This was their chance to prove not only that they belonged, but that they were destined. The referee's whistle pierced the air, a sound Riverside could not hear. But they didn't need to. They saw each other. They believed. And with that, the championship began. From the very first snap, Oak Ridge came out swinging. Their players moved like predators, fast and brutal, pounding Riverside's line with hit after hit. The scoreboard tilted quickly in Oak Ridge's favor, and the crowd roared with every blow. Riverside stumbled. A fumbled ball. A missed block. For a moment, it felt like déjà vu, the same nightmare from their mid-season loss. On the sidelines, faces fell. Doubt threatened to creep in again. But then, Riverside's quarterback gathered his teammates. He signed furiously, "Look at me. We fight. Every play. Every second. Until the end." The boys nodded, eyes blazing. The tide had not turned yet, but the spark had been lit. The second quarter was a storm. Oak Ridge threw everything they had, deep passes, crushing tackles, mind games. But Riverside adapted. Their silent signals cut sharper, faster, cleaner than ever before. A perfectly executed sweep stunned Oak Ridge's defense. A sack from Riverside's linebacker lit up the field. Slowly, yard by yard, they clawed back. Each play was more than football, it was a declaration, "We will not break." The scoreboard tightened, the crowd leaned in, the tension thick as steel. The game was no longer about strength or speed. It was about will. Who wanted it more? The fourth quarter. 2 minutes left. The score tied. The stadium throbbed with noise that Riverside could not hear but could feel pulsing under their cleats. This was the moment, everything they had endured, every doubt, every bruise, every whispered "you can't" came down to this. The huddle was silent, eyes locked, signals flashing like sparks. The ball snapped. One play. Another. The clock ticked down. Riverside marched forward, the field shrinking yard by yard. 10 seconds. One last chance. The quarterback looked at his receiver, gave a single nod, the signal that had been forged in countless practices. The ball soared, cutting through the night. Time seemed to stop. Hands reached. Contact. Silence. Then, the receiver clutched the ball in the end zone. Touchdown! The stadium exploded. Fans leapt to their feet, stomping, waving, screaming, a roar Riverside could not hear, but one they could feel shaking through their bones like thunder. The scoreboard glowed with victory. Riverside had done it. They hadn't just won a game. They had rewritten what was possible. Players collapsed on the field, some weeping, others laughing, arms thrown around each other in disbelief and joy. Coach Simmons stood at the sideline, his face streaked with tears, signing only 2 words, "We won." In that moment, silence was no longer an absence. It was a presence, a force louder than any cheer in the world. Years later, people would still talk about the Boys of Riverside. Not just because they were deaf, not just because they won, but because they refused to let the world define their limits. Their story became more than football. It became a blueprint for innovation, resilience, and belief. They proved that greatness doesn't come from what you have, but from what you create when the world tells you no. Like Steve Jobs once said about the crazy ones who change the world, Riverside was proof. Sometimes, the ones people doubt the most are the ones who redefine history. Their legacy wasn't just a championship trophy. It was a roaring silence that continues to echo in the hearts of anyone daring enough to dream. Here at the Reading Lens, we believe every book holds a mirror to our own struggles, and Riverside's story is a reminder that no matter who you are, no matter what the world tells you, your dream is worth a fight.